Jim Palmer called him a monster. He did not say it for effect. He said it because he lived it and because he had watched Billy Martin do things to players that left marks that never fully healed. When Palmer used that word, every baseball man in America understood exactly why. Billy Martin was a monster, but this story has two sides. Before we get into the terror, you have to understand what made him extraordinary. Martin was a baseball genius. He could see angles in a game that other managers simply could not locate. He made his players believe. Before we keep going, hit that hype button on this video right now and give it some hype. Now let us get back into it. He turned struggling teams into contenders almost overnight. His tactical eye was razor sharp. He read baseball games the way a great chess player reads a board, always several moves ahead, always hunting for an edge that other managers could not find. He pushed his players to win at a standard that most managers never dared to set. When his system clicked, the results were remarkable. Championship runs, division titles. He turned struggling franchises around inside a single season through sheer force of tactical will and pure refusal to accept losing. Players who performed under him often described something that felt close to transformation. He made them believe they could genuinely beat anyone. That was the gift. That was the version of Billy Martin that record books celebrate and highlight reels preserve for countless generations of fans who only saw the wins. But that gift came wrapped in something genuinely dark, because the same obsession that made him great also made him paranoid, explosive, and physically dangerous. The legends who played for him and against him tell the same story from different directions. He kept everyone around him in a constant state of alert every single day. 9 men in particular know exactly what that experience looked and felt like from the inside and from across the diamond. Their stories paint the complete picture of who Billy Martin really was when the cameras were not celebrating him and nobody was handing him a trophy. We are starting at the top and counting all the way down to number 1. These are the men who experienced the monster up close. Number 9 is Jim Palmer. Now, Palmer was not a Yankee. He was the enemy. He was the Baltimore Orioles ace who made a career out of making the best hitters in the American League look completely helpless. 3 Cy Young Awards, Hall of Fame credentials. A man who dominated his era with a combination of precision, durability, and competitive fire that very few pitchers in baseball history have ever matched at the same level. In any normal baseball world, a player of Palmer's stature would command a certain baseline of professional respect, even from opponents who faced him regularly. You might not like losing to him, but you would recognize what he was. Billy Martin did not operate in a normal baseball world. Martin operated in one entirely of his own design, governed by his own rules, and fueled by a need to control every narrative around him. In that world, greatness wearing the opposing uniform was not something to acknowledge. It was something to undermine before it had a chance to beat you. The feud between Martin and Palmer became one of the defining rivalries of the 1970s. Martin managed teams that faced Palmer repeatedly across multiple seasons, and every time those matchups came around, Martin refused to let it stay as just baseball. He took it personally every time. He started calling Palmer a pretty boy. Not quietly, not in private, in public, through reporters, in front of cameras, on the record where Palmer would be sure to hear it and everyone would be sure to read it. Martin insisted that Palmer was more interested in how he looked than in how he performed. He suggested that Palmer cared more about his image and his appearance than about competing and winning baseball games. Think carefully about what that strategy is really doing. Jim Palmer was one of the greatest pitchers alive at that time, a man who had earned everything he had on a baseball field through years of relentless work and elite preparation. And Billy Martin was standing in front of reporters calling him a pretty boy, specifically to strip away the professional respect that performance had earned. This was not competitive trash talk between players of equal standing swapping barbs in the dugout tunnel. This was a manager using the press as a deliberate weapon to psychologically destabilize one of the league's most elite performers before facing him on the field where it counted. The shouting matches between them became legendary among writers who covered the sport closely during that era. There were tactical disputes that turned deeply personal in a hurry. There were insults that went far beyond any reasonable boundary between professional competitors. Martin wanted Palmer rattled. He wanted Palmer standing on the mound with those words circling inside his head, instead of thinking clearly about his mechanics and his location. Sports writers of the era noted that Martin made the game lean toward professional wrestling, that he positioned himself as the bad boy of the sport and needed conflict to feel relevant. Palmer had the resolve to withstand the psychological assault and keep performing at the level his career demanded. But the fact that Martin felt the need to attack a future Hall of Famer through personal insults delivered through the media tells you everything about the lengths he would go to in order to get any possible advantage. This was number 9. and it only gets worse from here. Number 8 is Dave Winfield, and this story is different from the others because the terror Winfield experienced did not always arrive directly from Martin himself. It came from the machine that Martin operated inside of. George Steinbrenner had signed Winfield to a massive long-term contract and almost immediately regretted it. The owner became consumed by an obsession to tear Winfield down and diminish his standing within the organization he had been signed to represent. Steinbrenner went to extraordinary lengths to make that happen. He hired a man named Howard Spira, a gambler with underground connections, specifically to dig up damaging information on his own star outfielder. That is not a metaphor. The owner of one of the most famous franchises in professional sports paid someone with gambling connections to destroy the reputation of a player on his own roster. And where was Billy Martin through all of this? He was exactly where he always was when Steinbrenner was running one of his power plays from the owner's box. He was the pawn on the board. Martin maintained a cold and deliberate professional distance from Winfield throughout the period they shared in that organization. He kept that distance not because of a personal grievance, but because that was the cost of operating in Steinbrenner's world. To remain in the owner's good graces, you moved against whoever Steinbrenner wanted moved against. For a player of Winfield's stature and professionalism, this environment was corrosive in a way that extended far beyond anything physical. He came to New York to play baseball at the highest level, to compete, to win, to represent those pinstripes the way they were always supposed to be represented. Instead, he found himself caught in the middle of a war between two men who both treated him as a piece in their larger game. Martin, as a toxic element in that environment, meant that Winfield could never fully settle into the professional standard the organization was supposed to hold itself to. Being near Martin meant being near chaos at all times, and that chaos had a way of spreading outward and touching everything in its radius. Winfield was an all-star with exceptional talent and professionalism in everything he brought to that clubhouse every day he reported. He deserved a manager who recognized what that meant and protected it. Instead, he got cold distance, calculated maneuvering, and the quiet knowledge that his own manager was a willing instrument in an effort to damage him. That was number 8, Dave Winfield. Number 7 is Rod Carew. And this one is important because Carew is one of the cases where Martin genuinely helped a player reach a higher level of performance. When they were together in Minnesota, Martin pushed Carew in ways that produced real and lasting results. Martin even claimed credit for teaching Carew how to steal home, one of the most electric and daring plays in the entire game of baseball. And the truth is that Carew did flourish under Martin. He developed into one of the greatest hitters the sport has ever seen, a player who won batting titles consistently. So credit goes where it is due, but that success came with a long and complicated shadow behind it that deserves equal attention. Because Martin's brand of baseball, what he called Billy Ball, was an aggressive and high-risk system that consumed everything it came into contact with over time. Martin believed in pushing players well past their physical limits. That applied to his entire roster and most visibly to his pitching staff. He would force young pitchers to throw complete games at a volume that modern pitching coaches would call reckless and medically irresponsible. The physical toll on his roster across every stop he made was documented and undeniable. Players burned out under his system. Arms got overused and broken down before they reached their full career potential. Men who should have had 5 more productive years in the league saw those years shortened because of what Martin demanded from them and their bodies. Carew's approach to hitting was the opposite of Billy Ball in several fundamental ways. Carew was a thinker, precise in every part of his preparation and execution, methodical in how he approached each at-bat as its own problem to solve with intelligence and discipline. Martin was reactive, intense, and always pressing to force the action before the situation fully developed on its own. When those two competing approaches clashed over how to run a team and manage a roster day after day, the friction was real even when both men were producing wins together in the standings. What happened when Martin took his system to Oakland revealed the full and honest picture of what Billy Ball ultimately produced. The A's responded initially to the energy Martin brought into that clubhouse. The wins came. The momentum built. The whole operation felt alive again. But the pace Martin demanded was never sustainable because it was built on consumption rather than development. Players hit a wall that the system had helped build for them. Patience ran out across the roster. Morale collapsed from the inside out. Martin was fired. It was the same cycle it had always been at every stop, and it would always be the same cycle. Build something fast and burn it down faster. Carew had enough individual talent and resilience to outlast what Martin put him through. Many other players across Martin's career did not get that luxury. That was number 7, Rod Carew. Number 6 is Willie Randolph. And Randolph might be the most revealing name on this entire list for what he represents, about the specific way Billy Martin operated when he was at his most destructive. He was not a volatile personality who invited confrontation. He was not the kind of player who created drama or gave a manager cause to single him out for behavior. Randolph was the consummate professional in every sense of that phrase. He showed up every single day, did his preparation correctly, played intelligent and reliable baseball, and carried himself with a dignity that teammates across the entire roster genuinely respected. In any healthy organization run by a leader with any reasonable standard of fairness, a player of that character would be exactly what the manager protects and values above almost everything else in the clubhouse. But under Billy Martin, there was no such thing as a healthy organization. Martin would target Randolph during the middle of games, without warning and without apparent logic. Not in a quiet, private conversation after the final out with the locker room door closed. In the open, where teammates and coaches and cameras and everyone paying attention could see exactly what was happening in real time. Martin would publicly second-guess Randolph's decisions on the field during the game, while it was still being played. He would make it visible and loud so that the point would land on the entire roster, and not just on the man it was aimed at. Think carefully about the sustained psychological effect of that on a professional athlete trying to perform at an elite level day after day. You are competing in the major leagues, which demands your complete and total mental focus on every play. You have to track base runners simultaneously, read pitchers, anticipate cutoff plays, and execute movements under pressure while processing information at a speed most people cannot imagine. And running underneath all of that work, every single inning, every single game, is the quiet awareness that if your read is imperfect or your decision is wrong, your own manager will make sure the entire stadium and every reporter in the press box knows it was your fault. That weight settles into your game. It tightens your instincts. It replaces confidence with caution, and caution is one of the worst things a middle infielder can have on a baseball field. Randolph survived Martin and built a career that speaks entirely for itself across many years and many achievements. But the fact that even the most composed and professionally grounded player on the roster was not protected from Martin's unpredictable public fury tells you exactly how thoroughly his toxicity reached into every corner of that environment. Nobody was safe. That was number 6, Willie Randolph. Number 5 is Greg Nettles. And Nettles gave us the one quote that probably captures the full and honest Billy Martin experience more precisely than anything else ever said about the man. At any point during or after his career, Nettles was the Yankees captain. He was not a fringe voice or a casual observer who dropped in and out of the situation. He was at the absolute center of the Bronx Zoo era, inside the most chaotic and celebrated clubhouse in baseball during its wildest and most talked about years. He had a front row seat to everything that unfolded in that building. He had earned the right to speak with real authority on what it meant to play for Billy Martin day after day. And this is what he said: "The best thing about being a Yankee is playing for Billy. The worst thing is having to play for him." Read that one more time slowly. The best thing and the worst thing, coming from the exact same man and the exact same experience. That is not a contradiction wrapped in clever wordplay. That is the full and uncompromising truth of Billy Martin compressed into a single sentence by someone who lived it from the inside. Players respected his will to win at a level that very few managers in the sport have ever matched. They respected the fact that he studied opposing teams like a general plotting a military campaign before his troops crossed any line. He could outguess opposing managers on a consistent basis when the game was on the line. His instincts for matchups and in-game adjustments were sharp enough to actually change outcomes of games that seemed already decided. When Martin's teams were playing their best baseball under his direction, it genuinely felt like he was operating on a level of awareness that other managers in the dugout opposite him simply could not reach. That part of what Nettles said was real and deserved, but the other part was equally real and equally deserved of honest attention. Martin was, by the accounts of everyone who knew him closely, totally insecure beneath the aggressive and combative exterior. He constructed imaginary enemies when real ones were not readily available because his internal anxiety required constant confirmation that he was the one in control of every situation around him. He kept every player in a state of permanent uncertainty because certainty for his players felt threatening to him. His paranoia ran through every decision he made in a clubhouse, every public statement he delivered, every relationship he formed or destroyed, across every stop he made in baseball. Over time, that atmosphere exhausted every roster he managed. Teams would eventually stop buying into the system. When the belief drained out and the players started tuning him out, the authority Martin had spent years constructing collapsed around him rapidly. Firing followed every single time without exception. He was brilliant, and he was his own worst enemy, and he could never separate those two things long enough to save himself. That was number 5, Greg Nettles. Number 4 is Goose Gossage, and Gossage is one of the most important voices in this story because of who he was as a competitor. He was a Hall of Fame closer, a man who was built specifically for the highest possible pressure situations the sport could create. He had seen everything baseball could place in front of an athlete across his long and celebrated career at the very top of the game. He had faced the most intense moments the sport produces and found a way to rise to those moments consistently. His entire professional identity was built around performing under conditions that would crack most people. So when Goose Gossage chose specific and careful words to describe what it was like to play for Billy Martin every single day, those words carried the full weight of a man who knew pressure from the inside and was not someone given to exaggeration about it. He called it a constant state of alert, not occasional stress that came and went, not demanding in a way that pushed you toward your best version. Constant. Every single day in that clubhouse, players across the entire roster were on edge without relief. They were waiting for something to drop. They were watching each other and watching Martin to see who might be targeted next and for what reason. They were bracing themselves for whatever Martin might decide to do before the day was done. Would he call someone out publicly through a reporter that afternoon in a way that made the whole team aware of who was in trouble? Would a mid-game explosion target someone who had been producing consistent results all week? Would he push a pitcher into his 10th consecutive complete game attempt when the pitcher had nothing left to give and everyone in the stadium could see it? Martin used the media as a deliberate and calculated disciplinary weapon throughout his career at every stop he made. When he wanted to punish a player or assert dominance over the room or send a specific message to the entire roster, he went to reporters and said exactly what would cause maximum impact when it appeared in print the next morning. He made statements publicly that left individual players exposed and vulnerable inside the organization they were trying to represent professionally. The player then had to face his teammates the next day, knowing his own manager had gone on record criticizing his performance and his judgment. That kind of public humiliation does not remain contained in one corner of a clubhouse. It travels through the entire space and poisons the trust that teams need to function at their best under any kind of pressure. The most revealing part of Gossage's account is the simple fact that it came from a man who genuinely could not be rattled by almost anything baseball put in front of him. Elite closers at his level have mental toughness that is fundamental to the position they play. And yet even Gossage described the Martin atmosphere with discomfort that was plainly real. That tells you everything. When a man built to thrive under extraordinary pressure describes your environment as genuinely troubling, the environment is not intense. It is broken. There is a permanent and important difference between a coach who demands your best and a man who controls through fear. Martin was the second thing. That was number 4. Goose Gossage. Number 3 is Ed Whitson. And if you want to understand precisely how far Billy Martin's destructive nature could actually reach when it was running at full power, this is the story that removes any remaining doubt. Whitson was a talented pitcher, a man with real and documented ability who signed a significant contract to come to New York and compete at the highest level of the sport. The Yankees were supposed to be the peak of his professional career, the biggest market, the most famous stadium, the most watched team in the country. Instead, it became the worst chapter of his baseball life. Martin's relentless public criticism of Whitson was tearing the man down long before anything turned physical. Martin would pick apart Whitson's performances through the press after difficult outings, constructing maximum embarrassment in the most visible and merciless media market in the country. Whitson was already fighting the enormous pressure that came with pitching in New York. Every struggle is louder there. Every bad start is amplified by a press corps that never stops, and a fan base that remembers everything. Whitson was going through a stretch where the results on the field were not matching the contract he had signed, and instead of managing that situation with patience and private conversation the way a healthy organization would, Martin added to the noise. He kept the public pressure on a player who was already running out of room internally. He made it worse deliberately and consistently. That pattern of second-guessing and public shaming was exactly the kind of sustained psychological damage that pushes a man toward his breaking point. Then came September 1985 at the Cross Keys Inn in Baltimore. The accumulated tension from months of that treatment finally broke completely open in a confrontation that did not stay in one room or stay quiet. It spilled across multiple floors of that hotel before anyone could contain it. By the time it was finished, the physical damage on both sides was documented and extensive. Martin suffered a broken right arm, cracked ribs, and a bruised side. Whitson came away with a cracked rib, a fractured hand, and a split lip. These were not minor injuries from a brief and accidental confrontation. These were the injuries of two men who had come after each other with genuine and sustained violence. The professional cost extended far beyond the medical damage. New York turned on Whitson completely. Fans who sided with Martin made it publicly clear that Whitson was no longer welcome in that city. A pitcher with genuine ability and a lucrative contract was effectively driven out. He was traded back to San Diego. His time in New York ended in exile from the place he had come to build something lasting. Martin was fired at the end of the 1985 season, but moved on to his next opportunity as he always did. Whitson was the one who paid the price that could not be recovered. He lost New York. He lost everything he had come there hoping to build. That was number 3. Ed Whitson. Number 2 is Dave Boswell. And this story happened long before the Yankees circus was even fully constructed. This one unfolded in Minnesota in 1969 when Martin was managing the Twins through what should have been a celebrated season. And it stands as one of the most disturbing and direct illustrations of the physical danger that playing for Billy Martin placed real men in. Boswell was not a marginal player struggling to hold a roster spot. He was a 20-game winner. He was having the kind of dominant and career-defining season that opens every door available in professional baseball. The Twins were in contention. The season was going well by every meaningful measure. And then came the night behind the Lindell AC Sports Bar in Detroit. The trouble began when Boswell believed a coach had reported his behavior to Martin and gotten him in trouble he felt was unfair. Words heated up between Boswell and someone nearby. Martin stepped in to intervene and manage the situation before it grew. And very quickly and violently, it stopped being any kind of management and became something far worse than what it had started as. Martin knocked Boswell unconscious. His own pitcher, his own 20-game winner, left him on the ground behind a Detroit sports bar needing 20 stitches to close the damage to his face. And when reporters found Martin afterward and asked him about what had happened in that alley, he showed them exactly the kind of man he was when the public presentation was stripped away. He told them plainly that when Boswell came off the wall, he hit him again. No pause before answering, no visible remorse for the action, no recognition that putting your best pitcher in the hospital was something that should never have happened, regardless of whatever started the confrontation. The Minnesota Twins fired Martin at the end of that season despite the fact that he had delivered a first-place finish and a division title for the organization. The reasoning was straightforward. They decided they could not retain a manager who, as one account described the situation, had a fetish for punching out his own pitchers. Results mattered, but this went beyond results. Martin lost a job. He always found another one, but Boswell lost something harder to fully measure or replace. He missed several starts during what should have been the strongest stretch of his entire career. The momentum of a season that was building towards something significant got interrupted by his own manager's fists in an alley. Playing for Billy Martin was not simply professionally difficult. For some men, it was a genuine and real physical threat. Dave Boswell found that out in 1969 in the most painful way possible. That was number 2 on our list. Number 1 is Reggie Jackson, and this is the story that defines Billy Martin more completely and more honestly than any other, because of where it happened and how many people witnessed it. This one did not unfold in a parking lot at midnight, far from any cameras. This one did not occur in a hotel corridor in Baltimore in the small hours of the morning. This one happened on national television in front of 34,000 fans during a Major League Baseball game at Fenway Park in Boston. The entire country was watching. June 18, 1977. The New York Yankees were in Boston for a nationally televised game. When Steinbrenner signed Jackson to a 5-year contract worth nearly $3 million following the 1976 season, he did it against Martin's explicit wishes. Martin did not want Jackson. He had made that plain. Steinbrenner forced the pairing anyway, setting up a 3-way toxic arrangement between owner, manager, and star player that was always going to break in a spectacular way. On that June afternoon at Fenway Park, it did. Jim Rice hit a fly ball to right field. Jackson tracked it down and, by Martin's judgment, did not pursue it with enough urgency. The ball dropped for a double. Martin watched from the dugout and made his decision without a single second of hesitation or deliberation. He pulled Reggie Jackson off the field in the middle of the inning, not at the end of the half inning when the play was complete and the moment had passed. Not after a pitching change that could have provided some cover for the move, mid-inning. He sent Paul Blair out to replace one of the most famous and accomplished players in baseball while the game was actively and visibly being played in front of everyone, in front of 34,000 people filling Fenway Park, in front of the national television audience watching from home across the country. This was not quiet correction or private discipline delivered away from the spotlight. This was a deliberate and calculated public execution designed to humiliate Reggie Jackson in the most visible and permanent way available. Jackson walked into the dugout, and the confrontation that followed nearly became a full and public brawl on the bench. Jackson screamed at Martin. Martin charged toward him and had to be physically restrained by coaches and players before the situation turned into something that could not be pulled back from. The words exchanged were loud and direct and full of genuine rage. Jackson said everything he was feeling in that moment, and he said it with force and clarity. Martin was prepared to physically fight his own star player on his own bench, in front of his own team and a national audience. Jackson described the deeper meaning behind what happened that day in words that cut through everything around them. He said he was just a black man to them who did not know how to be subservient. He understood exactly what Martin was doing beyond the surface justification of a lazy fly ball. This was never really about hustle on one play in the 4th inning. Martin was using that nationally televised moment to issue a statement that had nothing to do with fundamentals. He was demanding submission in the most public forum available. He was telling Jackson, the owner, and every player in that dugout that no contract and no reputation and no level of celebrity could protect anyone in his clubhouse from his his authority over them. And Reggie Jackson was never going to accept that. Not from Martin. Not from anyone in any uniform. Steinbrenner ordered Martin fired that same night, then changed his mind and let him stay in the job. But the conflict did not end and it did not soften. It built further through the rest of that season and deep into 1978. During a series against the Kansas City Royals, Jackson defied a bunt sign, choosing to bunt even after Martin had removed the sign as a signal to swing away. For Martin, this was the final unforgivable act of open defiance. He treated it as deliberate and direct insubordination that could not go unanswered. Jackson received a 5-game suspension, but even winning that exchange could not keep Martin contained. In a public statement that became one of the most famous and repeated lines in baseball history, Martin labeled Jackson a born liar and called Steinbrenner convicted. That sentence cost him his job immediately. He resigned. The toxic loop that had been building since the day Jackson signed his contract finally consumed itself completely from the inside. What the Reggie Jackson story lays bare is the absolute core of what made Billy Martin dangerous and ultimately self-defeating as a leader. He could not coexist with a man who carried real and independent power. He could not accept someone who refused to be broken down and made smaller by the manager's decisions. He turned a championship-level baseball team into a daily war between ego and authority. He made the greatest team sport in the world into a daily test of one man's insecurity and what it demanded from everyone around him. And everyone in that clubhouse paid the price of proximity to that every single day of the season. That was number one. That was Reggie Jackson. So what do you do with a man like Billy Martin? How do you fully and honestly measure the weight of everything he was when you lay it all out together? He was a baseball genius. Mickey Mantle, his closest friend in the game, and a man who knew him more honestly than almost anyone alive, said that Martin was fiery enough that players gave him their genuine respect. And Mantle was right. Players did respect him. They respected his mind, his hunger, and his absolute refusal to accept losing on any terms. They respected what he was willing to sacrifice to find a way to win. His teams produced results across multiple cities and multiple franchises. His tactics genuinely worked when they were given time to work. His eye for the game was exceptional, and the record books confirm every bit of it. But Mantle also said that Martin carried a chip on his shoulder that resembled a whole lumberyard. And that was equally real and equally important to understand. Every victory he produced came with a cost attached to it somewhere. Every championship left wreckage behind it in the people who had been around it. The research summarizes the legacy honestly: broken arms and cracked ribs. And behind those words are real men, real careers that got shortened or derailed, real damage done to players who came to professional baseball with ambitions and deserved a manager who could challenge them without destroying them. Goose Gossage felt it in the tension of every single day he walked into that clubhouse and braced himself for what Martin might decide to do before the final out was recorded. Greg Nettles felt it in the exhausting and unresolvable contradiction of playing for a man he genuinely respected and genuinely feared in equal and simultaneous measure. Willie Randolph felt it every time he made a decision on the field and held his breath waiting for the reaction from the dugout. Rod Carew felt it in the relentless and physically unsustainable pace of a system that burned brilliantly in the short term, but was never constructed to endure. Dave Winfield felt it in being positioned as collateral damage in a war that was never truly about him or his performance. Jim Palmer felt it from across the field in a series of personal insults designed specifically to shake his confidence before he could take them out. Ed Whitson felt it most physically, and finally in Baltimore in September 1985. And Reggie Jackson felt it in front of the entire country on national television, in a Boston dugout where his own manager had just told the whole world exactly what kind of submission he expected. What baseball learned slowly and at real and lasting cost over the decades that followed is a lesson that holds regardless of what era you are watching. Winning does not excuse cruelty. Leadership built entirely on fear, and psychological domination is not leadership in any meaningful sense. It is control, and control that is not grounded in respect always fractures eventually, no matter how many wins pile up alongside it. The game moved forward. Clubhouse culture evolved through hard experience. Players gained rights and protections over time that made the kind of environment Martin created harder to sustain and easier to challenge. The sport became more honest about the real human cost of competition at the highest level. But it took men like Jackson and Gossage and Whitson and Boswell and Randolph and all the others who shared a uniform or a diamond with Billy Martin to pay that cost before the lessons could be learned by everyone watching. That is the truest and most honest part of the Billy Martin legacy. Not the championships or the tactical innovations or the Billy Ball philosophy that filled newspaper columns for years. The price that real people paid so that someone else could put a trophy in a case. He burned every house he ever built. And somehow, every single time the smoke cleared and the wreckage cooled, someone handed him the matches and pointed him toward the next one.